with the time that we lived in New York. It was someone who inscribed particular work that he did and how much he earned. He was evidently a day laborer, and he said what he did and how much he made, and this would be day after day, week after week, and there was one inscription where he had broke my arm, no work, and he had no earning. And it struck a chord in me because it related also to the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot. He measured his life in teaspoons. People come and go talking of Michelangelo, and that sense of measuring life in teaspoons was something that was very similar to that experience, and also very similar to an experience. I had talked about the fact that I had stopped being an artist for a while, and it was the time we went back to New York in 1985 to 1987, and I wanted to try something new, different. I didn't want to be poor anymore. It was a time of 400% inflation in Israel. It was a time of the Lebanon War. And we had two small kids, and with nothing, we went to New York, and I suddenly had this tremendous sense of responsibility of what I had done. And so I got a job working in graphics, and it was a very similar kind of experience. The work was interesting, but basically you work this, and you get this amount of money, you work that, there's no work, you don't get anything. And I realized at that point how much making art was important to me. And because I had never worked in graphics before, and there was a cleanliness, it was still just at the time that Macintosh and desktop publishing was just on the horizon. But everything was hand done with inks and pens and rapidographs and cleanliness. And instead of having like this really big studio with junk all around and collage and these different kinds of things, I think that working and Greeking in order to make like a kind of a demo or a dummy, a model of what you were going to do for the client, you would have to actually do this kind of Greeking or make the lines and then do these kind of like waves almost to show where the text would be. And all of these things really very much influence what I would do later. The fact that I would like cleanliness, and I would like to work with points and with sharp points and sharp knives, and work at a table as opposed to working on a wall or on the floor or on an easel. And this whole aspect of preparing something for print was something that was really very, very important for me. There was also another aspect. We were talking before about the changes that the computer had reaped. We were all hand workers, and there was a small group of people that would work with computers, and they would make these things very easily. And there were whole professions that don't exist anymore. There were linotronic workers, there were these inkers, there were these paste-up and mechanical people, there were people who did illustrations with marker illustrations and different kinds of things. There were retouch artists. There were people who made shadows with airbrush and things like that. I mean, these are professions that don't exist anymore. And realizing that in a short time, I'm talking about 1987, and I would still go back occasionally to work on projects like until about 1991 or something like that. And to realize that there were really very, very proficient people, proficient professionals in professions that didn't exist anymore. And when they reached a certain age, their skill was no longer applicable. Their lives were no longer applicable. And people would talk about going into different businesses, to go to do open cleaning businesses and different kinds of things. And to realize the fragility of change and the constant change and the possibilities that it reaps, but also the kind of ravages that change can wreak upon people's lives. I think that co-awareness, awareness of that dichotomy is always in me, and something that really sparks a lot of the kind of things that I do in my work.
Bring it back to the journal.
And I think that there was this journal that someone had recorded really the work life. He was a day laborer, he did physical labor, and he would say the kind of work that he did, how many hours and how much he made, and he did this day after day, week after week, month after month, and it went on actually for several years. And there was one point where broken arm, no work, the sense that everything was just chronicled and measured, very much like the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot, where life was just measured in teaspoons. The sense that this meaningless life would just be going on. And I think it really made it quite obvious to me really how important it was for me to make art as an artist, really not depending upon or having anything to do with how good it was or if it had anything to good. I think that also the fact that I work in series and work on pages of books, something that really reflects a kind of a journal or something private, even though that I know that has a public face and a public aspect and people will look at it, is really something very private about the book, which is something that appeals to me. Because Leonardo da Vinci maybe did 21 paintings that we can definitely attribute to him today. And for him, there's one painting which says everything. And for me, the kind of aspect of work that is, and model, which is really attractive for me, is the journal. It's something where you're writing in it every day, you're making little marks and drawings, and really kind of archiving and reflecting life. And you're reflecting one day and another day and another day, and these kind of accumulations create this kind of like archives. So the accumulation is important, as opposed to saying something clear with a beginning and a middle and a denouement and an end. I think that working in books and journals really freed me. I think also the fact that I began working on pages of books and in books, and that they were fairly small, and there were many, and I could work a lot. It was really a school for me. It was really developing a flow of energy and a flow of associations, and helped me very quickly, over a period of years, develop a real kind of like a lexicon of shapes and forms and language, which really accompany me all through my life as a person, as an artist. And I think that there are people that think that they have to have unlimited possibilities. And I think that, I think it was Mark Twain who said that a system that gives its people too many choices takes the choices away from them. And that you find that when you have a limitation of means and modes and subject matter oftentimes, that it gives you a kind of an infinite number of permutations and possibilities that you can really reflect. And judging upon what you choose and how you choose to combine it gives you a tremendous amount of possibilities and flexibility. I think that what I was talking about the attraction or why this really unremarkable journal where someone recorded their life as a day laborer, how much they worked and how much they earned. I think that there was a point in my life when I really felt like that. I really very much identified with the personality that maintained that journal. I think that it helped me really put a kind of like an X or a check mark on a particular experience, in the sense that it formalized for me where I wanted to be and where I didn't want to be. It was something that made it clear for me that I didn't want to live in the United States anymore, that living in Israel with all of its uncertainties and all of its difficulties also provided me with something that was very important in my work. And I think it also allowed me to really much more openly, with period of time, begin reflecting and absorbing those kind of influences and reflecting them in my work. I think it was really important for me to know that I didn't want to live in the United States anymore. It was important for me to realize that in order to continue living and wanting to live, that I really had to make art. So that led me to a particular series of decisions in terms of things that I knew that I had to do. And also as a teacher and also as an artist, I never really did something that had to do with money. They were not really things that had considerations for me in terms of what I want to do. Because I think that it's interesting that I think that as a creative person, I think that there are not really so many creative people that in almost any field that are really true atheists, in the sense that they don't believe that there's life after death. That I think that what I do, and I think that what a lot of creative people do, is that they create something which they impart to future generations. And even when art and artists was involved in destroying museums, theoretically, or previous art forms, or ways of creating art or thinking about it, there was always a sense that they were something that they were leaving behind them. Even when they were doing something that was anti-art, it was always something that had this kind of like a metaphysical aspect, that they were imparting something that had significance beyond their own lives. And I think that is a tremendous gift and a tremendous comfort. I think that also in my books, particularly in my books, there was really, and why I kept them in books for about 10 years is because they really were discussions with God. They really were prayers and prayer books in certain kind of a sense. That like in 19th century novels or plays, there's always someone in the introduction that says, "Dear reader," and he uses like the narrator at the beginning of a movie, he turns towards the reader as a kind of like a God figure, that the person is not alone anymore, and there's kind of like a marking and a legitimacy, which is really kind of important. And that kind of shared passing on of a feeling and an experience are really important. And I think that's something that's still true about making literature, making plays, making movies, and definitely making drawings and paintings.
So you're not talking about the spiritual life after death and the divine life after death. You're talking more as passing the life through your books, your art, film, whatever it is that one does. Or do you mean the actual divine life after death?
I think that it's almost impossible as it is to separate body and soul, or body and spiritual aspect. I think it's the same thing with art. That I mean, whether there's someone divine or life after death, as we would like to imagine it, is not something that's within the sphere of my consideration or my ability to think about. However, I think it's interesting when you look at a figure like Einstein, Albert Einstein. He was definitely a man who believed in God, and saw his universe and his view of energy and the relationship of energy to matter, and the inability to really destroy energy and what was passed on in a way that was really not only physical but mystical. And there was a kind of like a blending of the two. And there's a quote that is often requoted of Einstein: God doesn't play dice with the universe. And so whether it's the spirit which is passed on, the energy which is passed on, the energy of good, the energy of bad, the energy of interest, in the kind of like lottery of passed on existence, I don't really know, but there is the illusion, there's the hope, which I think is something that really motivates me and motivates, I think, a lot of creative people. I think that something happens to many artists when they reach the last decade of their lives. And oftentimes there are artists and creative people that have really kind of renaissance, a kind of a rebirth in their work. Someone who definitely is an example of that is like Philip Guston, born Philip Goldstein, which has for me a significance, and also I definitely admire his work for a lot of reasons. But I think that something happens when you begin thinking even much more acutely about the passing on, passing on of the life and the passing on of the content of one's lives.
You mentioned mysticism. Have you ever done anything with the Zohar, which is the main book of the Kabbalah, the mystical aspect of Judaism, or with the Kabbalah itself?
Yeah, there was. I'm not a religious person in a normal sense, or in an observant person in that sense, and I think I don't really know very much about mysticism, Jewish mysticism, Jewish books and sources. However, I do find it quite appealing. I think that artists oftentimes reflect their physical as well as spiritual and emotional surroundings. And when you live in Jerusalem, it's impossible to escape from the ubiquitousness, the ever-presentness of mystical texts and amulets, and their quotations of the Kabbalah, and they use oftentimes elements from the Kabbalah, and the sense that we were talking about before, about their. I think that what interests me in my work and in Judaism is the sense of dealing all the time with opposites. That our God is abstract, but at the same time there's something that makes it tangible. There's one God, but people think nothing of turning to different levels of angels or mystical beings or spiritual beings or ghosts to protect them against the incursion and against the threat of external fate. And so that for a number of series in my works, at different periods over the years, I've used Kabbalistic texts and amulets in my work. There was a series that I did that was shown in Jerusalem recently that also dealt with quotations from Tehillim or the Book of Psalms, and something very sensual that has to do also with the book. In the sense it describes the coming together, living as brothers of men, but also the kind of like oil dripping on the beard of David. It's something very sensual and very spiritual, and at the same time something where David, I think, really engenders something really deep in the Jewish psyche and culture, in the sense on the one hand he's talking to God all the time, and he's asking him to forgive him and to be gentle with him and understanding of his weaknesses. And then he says, but you know, if you punish me and you kill me, there won't be anyone to remember you and to sing your praises when I'm in the grave or in perdition, which is amazing because he talks to this being as if he exists, and then he says, well, you don't really exist outside of my imagination, and he goes on talking to him again. And I think that there are elements of the formal aspects of it, and also the kind of like self-contradictory, very personal nature, where you can talk to a kind of like being greater than yourself, outside of yourself, that I think I find very appealing in my work.
A little bit of biography. You touched on what affected your choice of, I don't want to call it profession, work. So I'd like to know more about your childhood, how, and especially in the thread that it affected your work And who are you? When did you become as an artist? How did you start? What kind of art? And and when the break you took, and then what changed after that? How did your art change? At the same time, you can touch upon whether or not your art is considered necessarily Jewish or not, or so those three, childhood, adulthood, art, different phases of art, and would it be considered Jewish?
Yeah, we may have to break down the questions and the elements of it, but I think ultimately a lot of my life really I did things for negative reasons, and I think that one of the things that spurred me on to be an artist was the fact that probably it was one of the few things that I wasn't encouraged to be, but I do think that even though my parents were really not educated people, I don't think that my mother ever, I don't know whether she ever went to high school or she finished high school. I know that my father had gone to a professional school to learn to be a tailor. English was not a language that they really could read. I think we really were encouraged to learn, and it's something that they respected. And Hartford, where I grew up, was blessed with a really fine, small museum, which was created at that time by wealthy people who had a real civic responsibility. And Hartford at the time wasn't the kind of like a failed state, poor town that it is now. It was really a very rich industrial center and the center of not only insurance, but American publishing industry. And they created a tremendous collection and a tremendous museum, and it was free. And for some reason, I went there. They didn't really take us from school. And it was someplace that it made it possible for me to realize that there was something that was called art, and something possible with time to realize that you could create art because someone created it. And they would wander around, and there were images really of that museum and some of the other museums. For example, Connecticut had a port, Mystic Seaport, a whaling port, and there was Scrimshaw. There were things that whalers, sailors used to use to pass the time, where they would take teeth of whales or bones of whales and sand them down into shapes, and then scratch images, and then use lamp black to blacken the images, which is very similar to the kind of objects that I make. I think the fact that my father was a tailor, and the fact that really a lot of the relationship that we had wasn't visual or wasn't verbal, but really was based on looking at things. My father showed me clothing a lot. Showed me what was good with clothing and not good, and what was good cloth. He would teach me to touch things and realize that it had nothing to do with the price, but really with the kind of quality and very tangible kind of aspect of it. I think also the fact that I really gave up my studio and began working at a table in a very particular kind of hunched over way had a lot to do with the way that my father sewed. And I think that for a long time, many of the images that I made had these kind of like marks or dots that really had a lot to do not only with the kind of Greeking that I talked about how you make something look like it has text, but also the way things are sewn. And the way that things are sewn, and the thread puncturing through the needle, going through the cloth and coming up again, and the kind of marks, and even the kind of like paper that would be made on the patterns, would be used for the patterns. I think that those things are really influenced me very much. The way that I would grow up at the foot of a dancer and learn to be a dancer in a kind of a traditional way. I grew up, and it took me a long time to realize that I could be an artist, because I think that nice Jewish boys don't only make art, they do something else. And so that I went to college, the Syracuse University, to study political science. And only really when I came to Israel in my junior year, and it engendered a kind of a crisis again, coming from the 60s and the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement, and coming to a place that had a completely different set of agenda and set of morals, I think, and things that they thought were really important, a different language, and I had to really define myself again. I saw an exhibition at the Israel Museum of Kati Kolovitz, a German artist, a socialist who really dealt with her social issues, workers' rights, against repression of workers. And I think that at that point I really knew at age 20 that I knew I wanted to make art. And then when I finished Syracuse, I went to New York. I tried to be an artist or learn to make art on my own, and realized that I needed some kind of framework. And so I went to Pratt Institute, where I did a master's in art. I went to museums a lot. And I think I was so unsure of myself at that time that I really wanted a school where they would leave me alone. And Pratt really did that. I think that was one of the benefits of the master's program at that time, is that they really left you alone. You had a studio, and at certain points, aside from certain classes, you worked and someone came by to talk to you. And I walked around the city looking at museums and galleries. I copied a lot of art, again in notebooks, and I think that had a significance. And I think that a lot of my working in notebooks had to do with travels back and forth between teaching or one place or another, always making plans for something else. But like John Lennon said in that song, life is what happens when you're busy thinking about something else. I think that it took me many years to realize that the thing that really interested me were the drawings, not as preparatory to something else, but as something on their own. And this last year, I stopped teaching. I think that part of like becoming an artist again, also in my own psyche, that nice Jewish boys don't only just paint. At 57 years old, I mean, I think that I've reached that point now where I can say that what it is that I do, what it is that is important, what it is that will make my mark and leave something beyond me, outside of my family and my children, I think are really things that have to do with my art. And I think that I can allow myself to be egotistical now in realizing that I have to put my energy and enjoy putting my energy into my own work as opposed to thinking about other people's work. I think that teaching was important for me in terms of helping me formalize what it is that I thought. It helped me get out of myself and keep contact with younger people and a lot of really disparate elements of the society, in a very disparate society and variegated society that Israel is, a very divided society. I had to constantly, I taught oftentimes not only in good places, but places that had people who had no art backgrounds, sometimes people who were older, sometimes people who were a generation away from a tent, living in a tent and raising goats and sheep. Or people who came from the Caucasus or different places. It wasn't self-evident the value of the kind of things that I was talking about, and so I had to not only listen to them and see what it is that they were talking about, but had to kind of like reformulate my own thinking in terms of their ideas. And I learned a lot, and it taught me a lot, and I really enjoyed getting into the lives of a lot of people. It connected me very deeply to the society, but I think now